Have you ever found yourself doing something you wish you weren't doing, such as having constant negative thoughts, or doing an action repeatedly that you wish you could stop, or feeling anxious in situations where you feel like you shouldn't be anxious? So, this is a video for you then. So, by understanding Carl Jung's ideas on the ego, consciousness, and the unconscious, we can better understand our minds and draw a map within our minds. And we use these as tools to examine ourselves and to live better lives. So, why do this? I mean, we got an answer a very long time ago from Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living. In order to live more fulfilling lives, we need to examine our mind and live in accordance with our true values rather than just go along with the wind. Okay, so first we'll start by explaining what Carl Jung means by the concept of ego. So you might be thinking that ego is this negative, materialistic, self-centered, selfish part of yourself that only cares about you and nobody else. But that's not what, now that's a commonly accepted definition of ego, but that's not what Carl Jung meant by ego. So Carl Jung had a very specific definition of ego. For him, ego served three functions. The ego served the function to desire, reflect, and act. So what does that actually mean, to desire, reflect, and act? So let's say this is your awareness, this circle. There are many things going on in your awareness. Now let's say you're driving down the road. There's traffic lights, there are street signs, there are pedestrians on crosswalks, and maybe you're thinking about the argument you had this morning with your partner. So many things are going on in your awareness, and the function of ego, if we say this is ego over here, this circle, the function of ego is to go into awareness and pluck something out and make that the center of your awareness. So for example, you might be completely focused on turning left, or you might be completely focused on that street sign, or you might be thinking about what you're going to have for dinner that evening. So there are many things which are going on, and the function of ego is a plucker. Pluck something out, make that the center of your attention. So I'd like you to think of, the last time you were driving, for example. What were you thinking of? Or right now, maybe you're focused on me speaking, or maybe your mind dozed off to somewhere else and you're focusing on something else. And maybe when you're scrolling social media later, you can see, oh, am I focused completely on that post? Or again, am I daydreaming of something else? So that's ego at work. So that's essentially the function of ego. But it does have its flaws, and its flaws are what lead us to, contribute to a life of depression and vanity. And so it's important to understand how to circumvent these flaws. But before we understand how to do that, we need to first understand what Jung meant by the concepts of consciousness and unconsciousness. Okay, so we'll start with consciousness. What actually is consciousness according to Jung? So the ego doesn't exist in isolation, like we said. This is the ego. And consciousness we can think of as awareness of our external and internal environment. We can almost think of consciousness as a container. So if this circle is consciousness, it's a container, and it contains all our memories, our thoughts, images, experiences, fantasies. And as we experience life, we fill this container up with more and more things. So here's a memory, here's an experience, here's an event which took place. And what ego does is it can go into the consciousness, like we discussed before, and draw things out to make our center of attention. And now, consciousness is actually life itself. It could be described as that. So if we think about animals, for example, animals have a sense of consciousness. So we can see crows. What do crows do? They use tools to get better access to food and water. And in terms of plants, we can see that plants also react to their environment. They release chemicals in response to different temperatures and different amounts of light. So we can see that plants also have consciousness, although it's a very basic or primitive level, not to the same level as a human. And consciousness is essentially the life force. So The interesting thing about consciousness is that when we look at stroke patients have a part of their brain dying, and this can essentially be represented within consciousness. So when the part of the brain dies, they lose their memories, they lose some of their ability to recognize objects, ability to recognize faces. And so what's happening is, while the container of consciousness is still present, they're still aware of their environment, what's happened is they've lost some of the things within their consciousness. They've lost memories, objects, experiences. And so essentially consciousness is independent of its contents. You can be aware of life while not necessarily having your container of consciousness filled up, if that makes sense. Okay, now that was the ego and consciousness. But what about the unconscious? So the unconscious is a deeper layer within our mind. So this is ego, this is C for consciousness, and this is UC for unconsciousness. Now, consciousness, just like consciousness, is filled with many things that the ego can draw from. But unlike consciousness, which can draw from things that we're directly aware of, the unconsciousness actually influences our lives in ways that we don't understand and in ways we don't realize. So let's say in my consciousness, I have the desire to go to medical school. This is a true story, by the way. And I want to go to medical school because according to my conscious, I think I'm passionate about anatomy and physiology. I'll be a great candidate. I'll be a great medical doctor. But if I examine my thoughts further, the real reason I want to go to medical school is in my unconscious, the real influence. This is because I crave social status. Now, being a medical doctor, of course, comes with a good degree of social status. And the real reason I want social status is because I want respect from others. I want approval. Now, that's the reason I want social status. Now, what's the reason I want social status? If we go deeper down into the unconscious, we can actually uncover the actual reason. So the actual reason I want social status is because I have a lack of, or I yearn for a sense of connection and belonging, community and fulfillment. And I think that I can achieve, fulfillment and connection with other human beings and community by achieving social status. And I can achieve social status by going to medical school. So we can see the real reason I want to go to medical school is that I'm feeling unfulfilled in an aspect of my life. And so here we can see that by examining the unconscious, I've unlocked the real motivations for my choices in life. And by understanding my motivations, I can better take control of my life and live according with my true values, which in this case, medical school may or may not be the true answer for what will give me fulfillment in life. Okay, so how do we actually access the unconscious? So like we mentioned before, the ego can go into consciousness as well as unconsciousness, but the ego isn't perfect. So Jung believed that a good psychologist, or I believe in this case anybody who is venturing on to explore their unconscious, he believed that they should refine their ego in a way to explore the unconscious where there are no biases. So let's take, for example, a scientist. Before a biologist, examines a group of cells, he would refine the microscope, he would clear the lens, focus the lens, ensure the machinery is working correctly to get the best possible image of the cell culture. So the same thing goes for the ego. So the ego is influenced by many false beliefs. And believing things without evidence, believe it or not, is actually important for human survival. And I'll give you an example. So as a child, for example, you were told by your parents, don't touch the fire, it will hurt you. And so you're a good kid, you don't touch the fire. And now you believed something without evidence. You didn't actually venture out to touch the fire and check whether or not it hurts. But that belief without evidence actually saved you from harm. So here we can see an example where belief without evidence is important. There are other examples where your parents maybe have told you something which stuck with you and you believed without evidence and it's false, so it actually harms you. So let's take, for example, you believe that you were told when you were a kid that, oh, showing emotions is weakness. You were told not to cry, not to show emotions. And so what does that do to you? So when you examine your unconscious and you find a belief that's actually hurtful, a belief that's actually affecting your life, say, for example, you were bullied as a child or taken advantage of, mistreated, and now these events during your childhood are influencing your adult life without you realizing it. And when you go to explore these memories, they feel hurtful emotionally. But you think to yourself, oh, showing emotion is weakness. I'm just being dramatic. It's not a big deal. And you move past those thoughts. You don't actually think about it twice. You just missed out on a very important memory. By uncovering this memory, you could have solved some current anxieties or fears that you have in life. So this is the ego essentially filtering out memories to protect you from shame or feeling vulnerable. And this is why, just like we refine a microscopic lens, we must refine the ego, look into our memories without any bias, understand them, and to let go of all previous beliefs, essentially to be reborn almost. We look at things through an objective lens. Okay, so what's interesting about the unconscious is that we can actually see people's unconscious thoughts through the statements they make, especially political statements. And most importantly, we need to be able to examine our own statements and where their roots come from. So say, for example, if I was to say that humans are selfish by nature. Now, from this belief, we can see, or from this statement, we can see my values, my fears, and my worldview. Values, fears, world view. So here, my values, my fears, my worldview. So from this statement, humans are selfish by nature. We can actually see the values of this person. So maybe they value independence and survival instincts. We can see their fears. So what are their fears if they believe that humans are selfish by nature? Maybe they feel being exploited or taken advantage of. And maybe these fears stem from the unconscious. So why do they fear being mistreated and taken advantage of? Maybe in their past, especially during childhood, they put their trust in someone and then they were exploited and taken advantage of. So what about their worldview? So we can see that they see the world as competitive rather than cooperative. And so from these simple beliefs, we can uncover so many truths about our belief systems and our unconscious. So there are many other influences known as psychic influences, Jung referred to them as, and these could be childhood memories of an abusive father, for example. So this psychic influence, what it causes is, for example, when you see someone who dresses similar to your abusive father, who has similar dress mannerisms, for example, we feel fear and anxiety since the ego has prioritized anxiety from this container of consciousness. And this would influence you, for example, to treat them in a cold manner, which would be you acting irrationally, but we can see where it stems from, the unconscious, and how it can make you act irrationally, essentially. So I'll give some examples in relation here on the screen, one for emotion. And so the first one is, after a breakup, the healthy reaction would be to be sad, of course, and to reflect on what happened and how to improve for a future relationship. But a dysfunctional example would be you feel uncontrollable rage and you lash out on your friends, you stalk your ex online. So we can see that a dysfunctional reaction, this could be caused by childhood emotional neglect, or you weren't cared for consistently, so your emotions were ignored and punished. And in the case of imagination and fantasy, you would, for example, escape into your imagination in a healthy way. So a healthy person would daydream about a new business idea or what they're going to do next weekend and sketch out a realistic plan. But a dysfunctional example would be to constantly escape into your daydreams, even in moments where you shouldn't be escaping into your daydreams, such as at work, and you end up ignoring tasks and not being as efficient as possible in your life. You might end up being fired from your job and not performing academically well, for example. And this could be maybe stem from you grew up in an unsafe, chaotic household, and so the only way to escape the outside chaotic environment would be to go into yourself, into your fantasy, as a coping mechanism to escape reality. Now, on screen, I'll put on two more examples, one for conflict processing and one for how we deal with our dreams, for example, or imaginations. So most our unconscious influences trace back to childhood, and this is a time we don't really remember. So this is why they influence us without us realizing, without actually recall these memories very well. Okay, so why is it that childhood actually affects us so much without us realizing? It's actually beyond the fact that we don't recall the memories well. So, as children, we have what Jung refers to as a primitive ego. The ego is yet to be fully developed, and our container of consciousness is pretty much empty. There isn't much going on. We have yet to experience much of life. And as we grow older, we fill our consciousness with objects, people, events. These are things from the outside, and we fill it up with things from within ourselves, like feelings, fantasies, and memories. And it's important for the expansion of the primitive ego, the ego within a child, for it to become a mature ego, that the ego or the child must experience conflicts with the environment. And what are conflicts with the environment? So, conflict you can essentially describe as a form of suffering, a form of hardship, where you have to do something hard in order to grow and mature as a person, to grow and mature your ego. So, for example, as a kid, you climb a tree, you fall down, it hurts, you learn the danger of heights, you never do it again. Or maybe we can see that kids are brutally honest. So, maybe you were brutally honest as a child. You said something to someone that was hurtful, you didn't sugarcoat it, and then hurting someone's feelings ends up hurting your feelings most of the time. So from that interaction you learn about the value of kindness. So you went through some hardship and you grew and matured as a person. So Jung referred to these as conflict. It's almost like going to the gym, doing some exercise. You tear the muscle in order to grow it and bigger and stronger. So the first time we do something, it's okay to be anxious. So the first time you go to the gym, you might feel overly self-aware and nervous. The first time you ask a girl out on a date, you feel nervous. But if you do these activities repeatedly, eventually they become easy, not as hard anymore. So what's happened is you've experienced so much conflict with the environment that now you're fine with these situations. But what actually happens if a child doesn't have enough collisions, if they don't experience enough of life's hardships? So maybe a child who tries to exercise their independence, their ability to practice free will, and they repeatedly get shut down within the household through neglect maybe or abuse, they end up growing into anxious adults. The reason they become anxious is because they've never developed a sense of control within these challenges. So let's take, for example, social anxiety. A child who is socialized a lot as a child has experienced many conflicts, many social situations. They've learned through the small hardships how to talk properly with another person, how to act in a social situation, what to expect in a social situation. And so in these situations, now they feel more in control. So now let's take another child who wasn't socialized at all. So what happens when they grow up and they've never socialized? They end up with social anxiety. They don't know how to talk to people. They don't know what to expect from a social situation. They feel doomed. They don't know what will happen. And so this is because a lack of collisions, essentially. Now, This is called maladaptive anxiety. So, adaptive anxiety are situations where we would all be anxious. It makes sense. We don't experience earthquakes or volcanic eruptions frequently enough to not be nervous or anxious about them. And even if we did, would still be anxious. Maladaptive anxiety is to be anxious in situations in which it doesn't make sense to be anxious, like a social situation. And so it's important to recognize our maladaptive anxieties. What situations have we not had a lot of collisions with? And we must put ourselves in these situations more often. Although it's harder to do as adults now, it's still important if we want to reach fulfillment and we want to reach our better selves. We need to force ourselves to experience the things that we find hard in order to grow our ego and grow as people. So like we said, collisions are important, in moderation, of course. Like training muscles, we strengthen and expand the ego. But there are extreme collisions, similar to, for example, jumping from the roof of a building thinking that it will strengthen your bones. It will end up breaking your bones rather than strengthening them. So these are called extreme collisions, and they lead to what Jung referred to as fragmentations. So for example, a child who, suffers abuse might have all these unbearable emotions going around in their unconscious, fragmented away, such as fear, shame, or helplessness. The ego blocks these thoughts out in order to protect the mind. So as an adult, if you find yourself in a similar situation, like harsh criticism from a boss, this might trigger your feelings of shame and panic. So, and this would be an irrational overreaction because the old trauma has resurfaced and we don't understand how to cope with it. So, for example, a child was constantly yelled at when they were a kid. They were told they were stupid, worthless, and all of the bad words. Now, in order for the ego to protect itself, in order to protect the child from being driven into madness, the feelings of fear, shame, and helplessness are split off from the conscious, fragmented away into the unconscious, so that the child can grow up essentially sane. Now, what happens is when they become an adult, the boss might, at work, they, finish off their Excel sheet or whatever, and the boss would criticize their work. Now, this criticism, although constructive, it might represent or resemble the memories which occurred at childhood. And so this leads the person to feel overwhelming feelings of panic, shame, and they would disassociate from the environment. And these feelings would be stronger than the situation actually warrants. They might shut down emotionally, avoid confrontation, and maybe even get a flashback to that unconscious event during their childhood. So because these people are so anxious, this ends up leading them to living a life of disappointment. So the person would try to avoid all situations which bring back that fragmented memory. So any small hardship in life or any small human interaction which resembles the traumatic childhood incident would create an irrational emotion of dissatisfaction, disappointment, fear, and anxiety. So the person who is, mistreated in childhood might idealize a new relationship thinking that the new partner will be their healer. And eventually, when, as in any relationship, living with anyone else that's not you, the other person will have flaws. They'll fail to meet our ridiculous expectations if we were traumatized as children, or maybe they make a mistake. And what these things will do is that they will trigger the defense system of the traumatized adult. The psyche, the mind will interpret this interaction as a betrayal. It will remind them of that catastrophic collision which occurred during childhood, and it will confirm their original trauma. The world is unsafe and people hurt me. So this irrational overreaction. The person then rapidly would devalue their partner, leading to constantly being let down and disappointed by every partner that they're with, and by anyone else, and by life in general. So these individuals are disappointed because they seek absolute unconditional safety from the external world in order to compensate for how fragile they are inside. And no human relationship can ever meet that standard of absolute unconditional safety. So these people have to really go into their psyche, understand why they seek such unconditional safety. Why is it that they are fragile? What is driving this constant sense of anxiety? What occurred in childhood that's making them mistrust other humans to the point where they cannot handle simple conflicts in adult relationships? So, one of Jung's most interesting ideas is that of the archetypes. Maybe you've heard of them before. So, like we mentioned, we have this pen, if it works, we have ego, we have consciousness, which are the things we are aware of. Can't spell. And then we have the unconsciousness, the things which influence our lives without us realizing, like childhood traumatic events or forgotten memories, things which influence our present life. And then beneath all that, we have the archetypes. A for archetypes. So, things we're aware of, unconsciousness, things we're unaware of which influence our life. The ego can access them both. Then we have archetypes all the way at the bottom. So, unlike consciousness and unconsciousness, which are things subjective to us, archetypes are things that we could say are imprinted in every human psyche. It's in our DNA. So let's take, for example, one of the archetypes which Jung presented us with, and let's look into how it influences our lives. So the hero archetype. So we're all driven by a sense of wanting to be strong, maybe courageous, overcome obstacles, and grow through challenges as people. This is a phase which we all go through in our lives. And this is something we all share, and what it means to be human. So you don't choose them, they are not subjective. These archetypes, they're already part of you. But by becoming conscious of them, by accessing them with the ego, you can gain more power over your life. Rather than them having influence over you, you'll have influence over them. And we'll look into a couple examples. The last thing I wanted to leave off with was the concept of the psychoid. The psychoid is essentially an unanswered question proposed by Carl Jung. So the psychoid is the border between our physical reality and the greater dimension of consciousness. So, and how they influence each other. So take, for example, when you're stressed. So we know that stress can increase blood pressure. It can cause irritable bowel syndrome. So we can see how the psyche influences our physical reality. When you take a sugar placebo pill, it actually causes physiological changes a lot of the time within the body. The opposite is also true. We know that physical reality can influence our psyche. So take, for example, when you're hypoglycemic, you haven't eaten all day, you feel agitated, you feel angry, or maybe during menstruation where there are hormonal changes, this can influence your mood and can influence your thoughts. So essentially what Jung is asking, so this is a puzzle that which one do we start with and which one do we end with? What Jung is asking, is the psyche just matter arranged in a complex way within physical reality, or does it transcend into its own irreducible dimension of reality? That's the question he leaves us off with. And that's all for today. Thank you very much.